Incoming message.
Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some source material that presents a seriously dramatic and honestly, kind of uncomfortable critique of colonial science. For centuries, established scientific communities flat out ignored local, indigenous wisdom, completely writing it off as just mere superstition. But the sources we're exploring today, they completely flip that traditional script. They're asking us to look at how ancient myths are actually incredibly accurate observations, and how local populations were, well, right all along.
Right out of the gate, the sources throw this incredibly provocative thought at us. Your ancestors weren't wrong about the world. They were just better at it than us. I mean, that challenges literally everything we're taught in traditional biology and history classes. We're all basically raised to believe that human knowledge only really kicked off when someone in a crisp lab coat finally wrote it down in a peer-reviewed journal. But what if the stuff your great-grandfather or your family dismissed as just folklore might actually be the most accurate historical record you have? What if those stories weren't born from overactive imaginations, but from direct, lived experience?
To really wrap our heads around this, the research highlights a few famous examples. We're talking about the giant sloth, the terrifying sea serpent, and the totally bizarre walking fish. For generations, European scientists pointed to these exact creatures as the ultimate indisputable proof that native populations were just making up fairy tales. They were entirely dismissed as absolute myths, that is, of course, until they became living proof. Fossil records, deep-sea cameras, and literal live specimens eventually proved every single one of these myths to be entirely 100% real.
Which brings us to a massively important question raised by the text. Why did mythology have to wait for science at all? Seriously, think about the absolute absurdity of this dynamic for a second. We treated generations of oral history and direct human observation like children's bedtime stories for over 200 years. If a local hunter or a generational fisherman said a creature existed, it was just brushed off. It's a staggering realization that the truth was sitting right there, being spoken by the very people who lived alongside it, but it was actively ignored simply because of who was doing the speaking.
Let's move to Exhibit A, the deep.
Our first piece of concrete evidence is the Kalayakanth. It is wild to realize the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the scientific community at the time. Science confidently, without a shadow of a doubt, declared this deep-sea fish entirely extinct. And we're not talking recently extinct either. They claimed it had been wiped out 65 million years ago. It was a totally closed case in all the textbooks. That is, until a local fisherman simply pulled a live, modern, completely unchanged Kalayakanth right out of the water off the coast of South Africa in 1938.
But here is where the story goes from just a really lucky catch to a massive historical indictment. Long before that 1938 discovery, the overwhelming cultural receipts were already there. I mean, the Sumerians documented this exact fish in their ancient texts. The Babylonians recorded it. The Egyptians literally carved it into hieroglyphics, and Chinese maritime records from the 1400s explicitly detailed its existence. We're talking about thousands of years of human observation from advanced civilizations perfectly describing a creature that modern science insisted had been dead since the time of the T-Rex.
And how did Western scientists react to those ancient texts before 1938? They literally called them impossible fables. They looked at explicit, detailed records from all around the globe and just dismissed them as the primitive imagination of unscientific minds. But, as our source material so brilliantly points out, the fish wasn't impossible. The scientific community's refusal to listen was.
That takes us to Exhibit B, the jungle expeditions.
This brings us to how specific cultural regions cataloged highly elusive species. Let's look at Congolese indigenous knowledge. For over 2,000 years, they possessed incredibly accurate, highly specific descriptions of the okapi. They noted it was a striped, deer-like, nocturnal, and highly elusive animal. They lived with it, they knew its habits. Contrast that with 1901, when a European scientist finally stumbles upon it, and suddenly it's celebrated as this heroic, groundbreaking discovery that shocked the world. The contrast is just jarring. 2 millennia of lived Congolese experience weighed against a sudden, self-congratulatory European press release.
The crucial point the sources highlight here is systemic categorization. Before 1901, the Congolese knowledge of the okapi wasn't unknown. It was just misfiled. It was explicitly tossed into a box labeled native folklore instead of documented science. It was categorized as superstition for literally no other reason than it lacked a European laboratory's stamp of approval. The truth was actively erased just because of the colonial lens through which the world was being viewed.
Moving right along to Exhibit C, the survivors.
This next section explores the honestly heartbreaking timeline of human memory versus scientific denial. Get this, for 10,000 years, South American indigenous memory accurately preserved the existence of the giant ground sloth. Their oral traditions documented this massive, very real creature that their ancient ancestors likely interacted with and hunted. Yet for 300 years, modern science flatly denied its existence, treating the indigenous memory like some mythological exaggeration. 10 millennia of incredibly accurate human memory, completely overshadowed by 3 centuries of a tiny blip of scientific denial, until fossil records eventually forced an apology.
And we see the exact same thing playing out in our oceans. Worldwide maritime cultures pass down stories of the giant squid for centuries. The kraken, the sea monster. It was the creature globally known by the people who actually spent their daily lives out on the water. But science? Science mocked it as a sailor's fairy tale. It was treated as a wild hallucination brought on by scurvy or too much rum. That was the rock-solid consensus until literally 2004, when modern science finally caught it on film. It took until the 21st century for a camera to validate what sailors had been saying for hundreds of years.
The text forces us to ask this heavily rhetorical, very pointed question. Why is the formula indigenous account plus folklore equals myth, while European scientists' observation automatically equals truth? Exposing this deep bias embedded in the history of scientific discovery is absolutely crucial, because it shows that the threshold for truth wasn't actually based on evidence at all. It was based on geography, race, and colonial power structures.
Let's wrap things up with our final section, the verdict. What we're missing.
So, what does this whole colonial blind spot actually mean for us right now? Well, the verdict is all about what we are actively missing out on. Take massive, undeniable animals like the Sumatran rhino. Science boldly declared it extinct in the wild, but indigenous people living in the region correctly knew it survived, and guess what? They were right. Or the giant panda. Seriously, how do you miss a giant panda? It was known to Chinese culture for 2,000 years as a vitally important, actually existing animal. Yet it was completely unknown to Western science until 1869. These aren't tiny microscopic bugs we're talking about here. These are huge, recognizable animals that local cultures successfully documented way, way before the West ever caught up.
What's truly staggering, though, is how recently the scientific record updated to include animals that locals had been living alongside basically forever. For all of human history, gorillas were known to the African cultures that shared their habitat. They were just a normal reality. Yet the mountain gorilla was considered an utter myth by the West until 1902. And unbelievably, the eastern lowland gorilla didn't even enter the official scientific record until 1924. Just think about that for a second. We literally had airplanes and telephones before Western science was willing to acknowledge the existence of the lowland gorilla?
Which brings us to a thrilling but highly dramatic reality. Right now, at this very moment as you watch this explainer, deep in the Amazon, the Congo, and the Sumatran rainforests, there are undoubtedly real creatures living out their lives. Creatures that indigenous peoples already know all about. They have specific names for them, they know their diets, they track their footprints.
But as the sources argue, currently, those creatures are just sitting there waiting for a laboratory to confirm that local experience. Modern science will stubbornly continue to call these undiscovered animals mythical. They're going to remain firmly locked in the category of folklore, simply because someone in a pristine lab hasn't caught up to the local reality yet. The sheer arrogance of the past, yeah, it's definitely still present today.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought. How long are we going to wait before treating oral tradition like the documentary it actually is? The question isn't whether mythical creatures are real. We've already confirmed so many of them. The real question is, how many actual living creatures are we still calling myths just because we absolutely refuse to listen? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope it leaves you rethinking the true value of the incredible stories passed down through history.
Come to me, chickens! Cock-a-doodle-doo!